We have a reaction now for Jennifer Kearns. She's a contributor for the Daily Caller on the Hill. We have Richard Roth, Democratic strategist and founder and partner of the Roth Law Firm. Dr. Tommy Tunson, he's a former police chief of Arvin, California there. Thank you all for joining us. Before I get to these stories, I want to get your reaction here. I want to play this for you. This is Attorney General William Barr here describing what happened. Here's that.
The voices of peaceful protest are being hijacked by violent radical elements. Groups of outside radicals and agitators are exploiting the situation to pursue their own separate and violent agenda. In many places, it appears the violence is planned, organized, and driven by anarchic and left extremist groups, far left extremist groups, using Antifa-like tactics.
Chief Tunson, I want to bring you in first on this conversation here. AG Barr is calling out Antifa on this. It's important to note what's happening. You have the peaceful protests that are happening. Then you're having a series of violence that's happening as well. There are calls that Antifa could possibly be involved in these organizations, anti-fascist organizations. Your thoughts on that? How much credibility is there?
Obviously, he has intelligence information that the normal layperson doesn't have. But I will tell you, the extreme emotion from decades and decades of feeling oppressed is really what's driving it. I don't doubt, just basically knowing about intelligence operation, I don't doubt that it's planned and there's an organization that's throwing fuel on the fire. But the fuel on the fire has been historical as well.
So how do you go about understanding what's happening today, Chief Tunson, because so many people are hurting, as you said, on both sides of it? What is right at this point? What is wrong? Your thoughts?
What we need to do is educate. We need to educate law enforcement on understanding the cultural history, the historical analysis of distrust. Distrust started way back after the Emancipation Proclamation all the way up to affirmative action. And a lot of that has boiled over and passed from generation to generation. So we need to at least train and educate our law enforcement officers to understand some of the cultural background and the history. It doesn't justify behavior. It does not justify violence. Violence and criminal activity and lawlessness is wrong, period. But understanding both sides of this equation, which I do through my transformational policing model.
Jennifer, I'd love to get your thoughts on this here, following up with Chief Tunson there.
Yeah, he's absolutely right. Look, big events like this do not take place in a coordinated manner in numerous cities across the country and across the globe. You just mentioned there at the top, it's also happening in London and Berlin and other European cities. Somebody is funding this, whether it is the George Soros nonprofits, or the Democratic Party. I don't think it's the DNC, but somebody on the left has an interest in funding this and seeing that it happens. And there are far too many people here that have a vested interest to make Donald Trump look very bad in the lead up to the summer months and on the tail of the coronavirus and leading into the November elections. This is a very coordinated effort. The chief is exactly right. And they say the mother's milk of politics is money. The same can be said of protests. This does not happen. Those kids are not out on those streets. And I'm talking about the more violent extremist element without somebody paying them to be there.
Richard, to you on this and your response to Jennifer here, again, the discussion of who's behind this, the violent parts of these protests.
Sure, and I think, Sean, that's the most important thing. We have to distinguish between the protests and the violence. There's protests in Europe, not violence. There's protests in 140 cities for a good reason. There's protests because of what happened to Floyd with a 9-minute knee on the neck. Those are totally legitimate, and we have to stamp out racism. It is outrageous how many blacks are getting killed by the police. But that's different than what Barr calls Antifa. Antifa, ironically, comes from 1946, the anti-fascist movement, anti-Hitler. But I agree with Jen that if if in fact there's violence, not protests. There's nothing wrong with civil protests. That's what this country is founded on. But if there's violence that's caused by these left-wing organizations, then I think it should be stamped out. What's important to note is that when you just quoted William Barr, he said it appears as if that's true. And as your first guest said, they have much more intelligence than we have. Let them go find out if in fact the violence is being caused by these very strong left-wing people who are trying to essentially make Donald Trump look bad and are ruining small businesses. I mean, these poor small business owners are having literally garbage cans thrown in their doors, in their windows. Then I think that has to be stamped up. But first we need to gather the intelligence, and we just don't know. Is it anger or is it hatred? There's clearly anger, but is that anger? That's the question.
We do have some hints here, Sean. We do have some hints. The Minnesota governor actually came out yesterday and said that their police officers are finding incendiary devices stashed around the city in an organized manner, and that protesters / rioters, more the rioters, are using cars that have the license plate taken off. This is straight out of the Antifa playbook.
Let me jump in really quick. I want to jump in because based on your point, I have a soundbite I want to play for you. Rioters breaking a concrete pavement to throw rocks. Watch this. Yeah, so again, I don't know if you saw that, but I mean, they're making weapons, Jennifer, there right on the spot.
Can I address the violence? I have been involved in this as a law enforcement officer for years. This is my fourth protest / riot incident. Watts in 65, Rodney King in 92, 2014 Ferguson, and now 2020. I have lived through all four of these. And I will tell you, the animosity, the racial disharmony that has been created is why I do what I do now at the college and why I do now in consulting, to make sure that we can transform and bridge the racial divide, which is now being fueled by other intelligent operations that we must also stamp out.
Chief, I want to get back to you on that point really quick, and then I'll get to you guys. But this whole thing, it's definitely understandable. I guess my thought here, or my question for you is, how do you feel about those taking advantage of this moment, those taking advantage of these peaceful protests that are done on behalf of George Floyd, that are opposing racism that has been in this country for so long? How do you feel about those organizations stepping in under the guise of George Floyd and others?
I'm very sad and disappointed. This is a legitimate issue with racism because I've experienced it myself, and it's very disheartening to see what is being done to advantage. Poor Mr. Floyd should never have experienced what he did. I've been involved in situations where I've had to pull officers away from somebody harming and hurting somebody, and it's just sad to see that a legitimate issue such as racial disharmony is taken into account to be used against and amplify this particular problem.
Richard, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I think he's right, and I think we have to get to the bottom of it. Jen may be right. If this is a left-wing organizations that are using this as a cause and causing hatred and violence, that's a real problem. If, on the other hand, it's anger, there's a lot of angry people out there, and they're just protesting, that's okay. If that anger leads to violent protests, that's not good, because what it's doing is it's hurting Donald Trump, but it's also hurting the small businesses. When you see what they're doing on the streets in Minneapolis and Atlanta and New York and burning police cars, that's just not acceptable. I think it was Martin Luther King said that hate cannot drive down hate, and that's what's going on here. They can be angry, but they can't be vicious. They can't be violent. And that's the question. Is it these organizations or not?
I got to dip out. We're out of time, but we're going to bring you back in just a bit. But nevertheless, I just want to say here, it's important to have these conversations, healthy discussions that we're having here on this program. Again, trying to get all the facts, trying to understand each side of this, not just one. Thank you all. Jennifer Kearns, Richard Roth, Dr. Tommy Tunson, thank you for that.